Imagine waking up one day and realizing your DNA holds the memory of kingdoms lost, migrations forgotten, and ancestors who walked the land before borders were drawn. Not in some abstract sense, but in real, traceable strands passed down to you, bloodlines that stretch beyond the Red River Delta, through mountain valleys, and across ancient seas. Vietnam, often seen through the lens of war, food, or breathtaking landscapes, hides something far more personal beneath its surface. A genetic story so intricate, so unexpected, that even science is still catching up. Because within the Vietnamese genome lies a secret, not just of one people, but of many, woven together by time, survival, and movement. This isn't just about ancestry. This is about uncovering a hidden record of the human journey, carved into the cells of over 96 million people. From the oldest hunter-gatherers in Southeast Asia to seafarers from distant islands, from farmers of the Yangtze to warriors of ancient bronze cultures, their stories didn't vanish. They live on, in you. And today, we're going to decode them. Forget everything you think you know about Vietnam's past. This isn't just history. It's living, breathing legacy. So why does the Vietnamese genome defy simplicity? Why do scientists find fragments of Aboriginal Australian ancestry in the north, yet Austronesian signatures in the south? Why are there over 50 ethnic identities, yet a shared genetic thread among many? These aren't just trivia questions. They challenge how we understand who the Vietnamese truly are. Because the answer isn't one tribe. It's many timelines. It's the ghost of kingdoms buried under rice paddies. It's the imprint of empires, migrations, and forgotten civilizations. And it's all still there, waiting to be read, one strand at a time. If you think DNA is just science, think again. This is identity. This is belonging. This is memory, encrypted. And by the end of this journey, you'll never look at Vietnam, or yourself, the same way again. Tucked between mountains, rivers, and the South China Sea, Vietnam is more than just a country on the map. It's one of the most genetically layered regions on Earth. This isn't just poetic metaphor. It's hard genomic fact. At first glance, Vietnam might seem culturally unified, but beneath the language, traditions, and flags lies a staggering truth. The land is home to 54 officially recognized ethnic groups, speaking over 110 languages, each carrying distinct ancestral codes. This is not the story of one origin, it's the convergence of dozens. Vietnam's geography made it a natural hub for ancient human migration. Its long S-shaped curve forms a genetic bridge between southern China and island Southeast Asia, between the Himalayas and the Pacific. Waves of people came, some stayed, some moved on, but all left behind genetic fingerprints. The Kin people, today's majority, make up over 85% of the population, but their dominance tells only part of the story. The remaining 15% hold fragments of lineages that connect to peoples as diverse as Tibetan herders, Malay traders, and Austronesian seafarers. And they don't just carry traditions, they carry DNA that can't be found anywhere else on Earth. In most countries, language and genetics loosely align, but not here. In Vietnam, two people may speak the same tongue, but come from entirely different ancestral branches. Others may speak unrelated languages, and yet share deep genomic roots. This genetic mismatch hints at centuries of cultural diffusion, where language traveled faster than bloodlines, and ideas crossed rivers long before genes did. It's why two ethnic groups in adjacent provinces can look, live, and sound different, yet carry overlapping markers in their cells. Vietnam's DNA tells a story of adaptation and survival in a landscape that demanded it. Highlands and lowlands shape different ways of life, and different genetic profiles. Isolation in the mountains led some groups to retain rare haplogroups that vanished elsewhere. Coastal interaction brought in fresh gene flow, introducing genetic traces from India, Arabia, even East Africa, through maritime trade long before textbooks say it happened. But what makes Vietnam truly unique is the way these layers were never erased, only added to. Where other regions saw replacement, Vietnam saw mixture. New groups arrived and folded into the existing fabric, forming a complex genetic quilt stitched over thousands of years. A person from the Red River Delta may carry genes from Neolithic rice farmers and Dong Sun metallurgists. Meanwhile, Someone from the southern highlands could show signatures from Austroasiatic-speaking ancestors and seafaring Austronesians, all within one generation. This isn't just population genetics. This is Vietnam's biography, written not in ink, but in code. A country formed not by a single tribe, but by a constant, messy, beautiful entangling of peoples. A nation where identity was never static, and where history isn't just remembered, it's inherited. Long before Vietnam was a name, a language, or a nation, there were people living in its caves, walking its forests, and hunting its rivers. These earliest inhabitants, known to researchers as the Hoabinhian, lived over 10,000 years ago, and their DNA is nothing short of astonishing. In fact, it rewrites the idea of where the Vietnamese story begins. Excavations in places like Mon Bac have uncovered skeletal remains that carry a deep ancestral echo, one not aligned with East Asia, but instead with Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. Yes, some of the oldest Vietnamese carry mitochondrial lineages that trace all the way to Oceania. This isn't theory. This is confirmed by genome-wide studies and ancient DNA analysis, placing the Hoabinhian people among the first wave of modern humans to settle Southeast Asia, a population older than agriculture, kingdoms, or metal tools. But they didn't remain alone. They were eventually joined by other groups, migrants from the north bringing farming and new technologies. What's remarkable is that the Hoabinhian legacy wasn't wiped out. It was absorbed, slowly diluted, but never fully lost. Even today, subtle traces of their ancestry remain in isolated ethnic groups deep in Vietnam's mountainous regions. Their legacy isn't just in genetics. It's in cultural patterns that predate recorded history. The tools they left behind, simple, elegant stone flakes, form the basis of what's called the Hoabinhian technocomplex, a distinctive archaeological tradition that spread across the region. But more importantly, their genetic influence laid the foundation for all the populations that came after. They represent an ancient branch of humanity that diverged before many Asian and European populations even existed. Their survival, especially in fragmented traces within modern Vietnamese DNA, is a clue to the deep continuity of life in this land. They were here before the Red River became a cradle of civilization, before any recorded empire rose in the Delta. Before Vietnamese had a name, there were already humans whose bloodlines would flow, invisibly, into millions who live in the region today. We often think of history as something that begins with writing, monuments, or kings. But for Vietnam, the true beginning lies far deeper, in the shadows of time, with a people whose existence is almost forgotten, yet still quietly present in the very genes of their descendants. Their presence isn't in the textbooks. It's in the molecular fossils of the living, and it's only through the lens of modern science that we're beginning to hear their silent voice again. Roughly 4,000 years ago, a new kind of transformation swept across what is now northern Vietnam, not through conquest, but through cultivation. This shift wasn't led by kings or armies, but by migrants from southern China who carried something far more powerful than weapons: knowledge of farming, and more specifically, the delicate, life-altering art of growing rice. These newcomers weren't just agriculturalists. They belonged to early Austroasiatic-speaking communities, and with them came a genetic imprint that would alter the structure of Vietnam's population forever. Archaeological evidence tells us that as these rice farmers moved southward along the river valleys, they brought with them not only tools and seeds, but also new cultural systems, shaping daily life across the region in ways that would persist for millennia. Genetic data adds an even more compelling dimension to this narrative. Studies show that this Neolithic migration carried what's known as Dushan-related ancestry, contributing roughly 2/3 of the genetic material found in Bronze Age populations, like those from Nui Nap. The rest came from northern East Asian sources. This mixing wasn't a one-time event. It was a gradual blending, layer by layer, generation after generation. What's truly fascinating is how these new agricultural societies didn't simply replace the older Hoabinhian foragers. Instead, they merged. Their genetic signatures fused in the bodies of the children they raised together. Over time, this merging gave rise to the foundation of modern-day Vietnamese populations, especially the Kin majority. This was more than just gene flow. It was the beginning of ethnogenesis, the emergence of a new people through biological and cultural synthesis. The rivers, the Red River and Mekong in particular, acted as highways for this transformation. They connected villages, facilitated trade, and enabled farming communities to thrive. These waterways weren't just geographic features. They were agents of change. Along their banks, early forms of social complexity emerged: organized labor, stratified societies, and eventually the roots of what would become legendary civilizations. This era also marked a turning point in how humans interacted with their environment. The wet rice agriculture brought by these Neolithic migrants required precise coordination, terracing, irrigation, seasonal planning, and this created the conditions for long-term settlement and population growth. For the first time in this region's history, communities could expand, specialize, and defend territory. But it wasn't just local evolution. These migrants carried with them ancient memories from the Yangtze and Pearl River valleys, making Vietnam part of a much larger civilizational arc stretching across East and Southeast Asia. Their language became the root of Vietnamese. Their crops became the foundation of its cuisine, and their genes became the framework of a national identity that still carries their imprint, thousands of years later. So when we speak about the Southern Chinese Neolithic surge, we're not talking about a distant wave of faceless farmers. We're talking about the arrival of something monumental, the convergence of soil, seed, and blood, reshaping not just landscapes, but lifelines. Rising from the fertile floodplains of the Red River Valley, an ancient civilization began to flourish, one that would carve its legacy into bronze and bone alike. The Dong-Sun culture, emerging around 2,500 years ago, wasn't just a technological leap. It was a turning point in the shaping of Vietnamese identity, socially, culturally, and genetically. The hallmark of this civilization was its astonishing craftsmanship, most famously the Dong-Sun drums, massive, ornately cast bronze instruments that symbolized power, ritual, and unity. But behind these artistic marvels lay a deeper revolution: the consolidation of farming communities into stratified societies, organized labor, long-distance trade, and the rise of an elite class. These weren't just artisans. They were builders of a new socio-political order. What's often missed, however, is that the people behind this cultural bloom were not genetically isolated. They carried within them a blend of ancestries, the result of centuries of merging between earlier agriculturalists from the north and local populations rooted in Southeast Asia. Genetic comparisons between modern Vietnamese and remains from Dong-Sun burial sites confirm a direct ancestral link, especially with the Kin population. These Bronze Age communities formed what can only be described as a genetic corridor, acting as a bridge between ancient northern gene pools and emerging southern identities. This wasn't merely a geographic crossroad. It was a genomic nexus. People here inherited strands from previous Neolithic migrants, and also passed those genes southward as their influence expanded. The significance of Dong-Sun isn't limited to metallurgy or migration. It marks the point at which Vietnamese identity began to crystallize. Through rituals, language, burial practices, and shared cultural symbols, a collective consciousness began to form, something that went beyond village borders. And because their genetic signatures align closely with modern kin groups, it's clear that this culture wasn't a dead end, but a living root still visible in the DNA of millions today. Archaeology tells us that Dong-Sun people traded widely. Their bronze drums have been found as far away as Indonesia and southern China. But genetic data reveals something just as important: the flow of people. Not all movement leaves visible artifacts, but it does leave traces in the genome. Those traces show a population with broad connections, but also local continuity. People who absorb new ideas while preserving inherited lineages. The expansion of Dong-Sun influence also coincides with the gradual formation of early Vietnamese states. This wasn't a sudden leap into kingship or empire, but a slow evolution where technology, trade, and shared ancestry laid the groundwork for future political unity. So, while the gleam of bronze may catch the eye, it's the invisible story within the people that reveals the deeper truth. The Dong-Sun culture wasn't just a high point of ancient innovation. It was a crucible of identity, forging the early shape of a people who were becoming something new, yet deeply rooted in everything that came before. Step outside the bustling cities of Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh, and you enter a world where languages shift every few valleys, where clothing patterns change from one village to the next, and where ancestry is not shared by one majority, but carried by dozens of distinct groups. Vietnam isn't a single-threaded story. It's an intricate weave of ethno-linguistic diversity, unmatched across much of Asia. The kin may form the demographic core of the nation, but they share the land with 53 other officially recognized ethnic groups, many of whom have remained genetically and culturally distinct for centuries. These communities speak languages belonging to 5 major families: Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Hmong-Mien, Tai-Kadai, and Sino-Tibetan, each carrying their own ancestral histories, separate from the mainstream narrative. What genetics uncovers here is extraordinary. Even among groups that speak similar languages, DNA often tells a more complex tale. For instance, some Austroasiatic-speaking populations living in the Central Highlands show closer genetic links to southern neighbors than to other groups in their own language family. And in many cases, linguistic shifts occurred not because of large-scale migration, but through cultural diffusion, where communities adopted new tongues without significant genetic mixing. The geographic layout of Vietnam plays a crucial role. Its sharp mountains, narrow river valleys, and dense forests have allowed some populations to remain isolated, preserving unique genetic profiles that differ sharply from even nearby groups. Others, especially those along ancient trade routes or border zones, show evidence of admixture from multiple directions, blending ancestry from southern China, northern Laos, or coastal Cambodia. One of the most revealing patterns is how much variation exists within language families. For example, not all Tai-Kadai speakers in Vietnam share the same genetic background. The Tay, Thai, and Nung may use related languages, but their genome-wide data shows they've been shaped by different historical events and interactions. Similarly, within the Hmong-Mien family, the Dao and Hmong show overlapping ancestry, but with subtle differences suggesting more recent divergence. And then there are groups that appear to stand almost alone. The Mang and Silla, for example, exhibit genetic signatures that don't closely align with any major group in Vietnam. These small populations carry the marks of ancient bottlenecks, meaning their ancestors likely survived through severe demographic contractions, preserving older genetic lineages that have nearly vanished elsewhere. Even more fascinating is the way regional variation cuts across ethnicity. In the north, many groups share more in common with southern Chinese populations. In the south, certain communities carry traces of historical maritime connections, including links to Austronesian-speaking cultures of island Southeast Asia. The coastal lowlands, mountain highlands, and river basins each serve as zones of genetic contrast, shaped by geography, history, and social structure. The genetic diversity hidden within Vietnam's borders challenges any idea of a uniform identity. Instead, it reveals a living map of human history, one written in migration, marriage, isolation, and adaptation. It tells us that Vietnamese identity is not singular or static. It's dynamic, layered, and deeply regional. Every ethnic group carries its own legacy, not only in its language or customs, but in its DNA. And only by understanding these differences can we begin to appreciate the full scope of Vietnam's ancestral mosaic, a tapestry not just of people, but of time itself. Hidden deep within Vietnam's forests, highlands, and borderlands are communities whose genetic stories defy expectation. These are not footnotes to the Vietnamese identity. They are vital chapters that reveal layers of ancestry untouched by mainstream narratives. While national attention often gravitates toward the kin, it is among the ethnic minorities that some of Vietnam's most unique genetic signatures are preserved. Take the Cham people of central Vietnam. Their language belongs to the Austronesian family, connecting them to ancient seafarers of the Pacific. Yet their DNA tells a story not of isolation, but of interaction. Genomic studies show the Cham are a genetic mosaic, blending ancestry from local Austroasiatic groups with input from distant Austronesian lineages. Interestingly, while some Cham show distant connections to Taiwan's Atayal people, others reflect centuries of regional intermarriage, creating a profile found nowhere else in Southeast Asia. In the southern highlands, The Eid and Jiri also speak Austronesian languages, but genetically, they align more closely with Austroasiatic ancestry. This mismatch between language and lineage offers compelling evidence of language shift without population replacement, a process where communities adopt a new language through prolonged cultural contact rather than migration. Their maternal DNA also hints at a practice of matrilocality, where women remain in their birth communities after marriage, helping preserve ancient maternal lineages over time. Among Hmong groups, the Dao and Hmong present a tightly linked genetic cluster, reflecting a shared origin in southern China. Yet subtle distinctions reveal divergent paths. The Dao, for instance, show signs of recent genetic blending with nearby Taikadai populations, likely the result of centuries of intergroup interaction along mountainous trade corridors. The Hmong, in contrast, have retained a more distinct profile, suggesting long-term demographic stability in certain regions. Meanwhile, the Sino-Tibetan-speaking groups such as the Lolo, Fula, and Sila stand apart in Vietnam's genomic landscape. Their genetic patterns suggest minimal mixing with other Vietnamese groups, forming an independent cluster that reflects both geographic isolation and cultural cohesion. Yet even within these groups, some like the Fula show overlapping ancestry with Hmong and Thai-speaking neighbors, indicating that even in remoteness, genetic borders were porous. Then there are the true outliers, groups like the Mang and Komu, whose DNA doesn't comfortably align with any major population in the region. These communities carry rare haplogroups and show low levels of shared drift with other Vietnamese groups, pointing to long histories of genetic seclusion. Their lineages act as living time capsules, preserving ancient population structures that may have existed before major waves of migration reshaped the region. What's clear from all these examples is that Vietnam's ethnic minorities are not simply peripheral populations. They are guardians of deep genetic legacies. Their genomes retain patterns erased in more cosmopolitan groups, offering rare insight into the human migrations that shaped mainland Southeast Asia. These aren't static communities frozen in time. They are dynamic populations whose histories are etched not only in folklore, but in the strands of DNA passed down through generations. Understanding these genetic patterns is more than a scientific exercise. It's a recognition that every hill tribe, every remote village, every distinct dialect represents not just cultural richness, but biological history. And within their diversity lies the clearest reminder. The story of Vietnam was never one story. It was always many. Along Vietnam's central coast once stood a powerful kingdom few remember today, but its echoes remain etched in the genes of modern people. This was Kampa, a vibrant maritime state rooted in Austronesian culture, trading silk, spices, and ideas across the seas. While its towers crumbled centuries ago, its legacy was never fully erased. It quietly seeped into the population through something far more enduring than stone DNA. The Austronesian footprint in Vietnam is subtle but profound. Groups like the Cham, Jiri, and Eid still carry fragments of this lineage, even as their cultural identities have been shaped by centuries of interaction with neighboring peoples. What sets these groups apart isn't just language or tradition, but a distinct ancestral signal that reaches back to seafaring populations who once voyaged across the Pacific in canoes. For the Cham in particular, the genetic record is a mosaic of histories. While some of their ancestry ties them to other Austronesian-speaking groups, including remote links to Taiwan, much of it reflects a deeper integration with local Southeast Asian populations. This mixed profile points to a complex history of settlement, assimilation, and survival, a process that accelerated after the kingdom's collapse in the 15th century. When the southern push of the Vietnamese, known as the Nam Tien, engulfed Kampa's heartland, it wasn't just territory that changed hands. It was bloodlines. Over time, Cham communities were displaced, absorbed, or fragmented, but their genetics endured, particularly in central and southern Vietnam, where certain lineages remain traceable to their Austronesian past. Meanwhile, groups like the Jiri and Eid, who also speak Austronesian languages, present an even more unusual pattern. Despite their linguistic roots, their genetics suggest stronger ties to mainland Southeast Asian ancestry, especially Austroasiatic lineages. This disconnect between language and genetics suggests a long process of cultural borrowing, where languages spread across communities without major population movement. What likely contributed to the preservation of unique maternal lineages in these groups is a rare social practice: matrilocal residence. In these societies, women remain in their birth villages while men move in after marriage. Over generations, this stabilizes and preserves female-inherited mitochondrial DNA within the community, offering a rare window into maternal ancestry over thousands of years. The collapse of Kampa wasn't a disappearance. It was a transformation. Its people didn't vanish. They melted into the broader fabric, contributing their heritage to the populations around them. And that legacy still speaks today. In the genes of a southern farmer, the profile of a coastal family, or the mitochondrial markers of an ethnic minority once forgotten by history. The Austronesian chapter of Vietnam is a reminder that cultural memory can fade, but the body remembers. And the remnants of Kampa, carried silently in the genome, continue to whisper stories of ocean crossings, royal courts, and civilizations whose greatness still flows beneath the skin of the living. Beneath the surface of northern Vietnam's population lies a genetic influence, shaped not by ancient seafarers or highland isolation, but by a different force altogether: imperial expansion. Over 1,000 years of Chinese rule didn't just reshape politics and culture. It subtly, steadily rewrote the genetic landscape, leaving behind traces that can still be read today in the bloodlines of millions. When the Han Empire extended its grip southward during the first millennium BCE, it brought more than soldiers and administrators. With them came settlers, merchants, and intermarriage, a slow demographic current that introduced northern East Asian ancestry into what had long been a diverse and mixed region. Genetic studies show that Han admixture is present, but not overwhelming, suggesting that instead of mass replacement, what occurred was blended assimilation, driven by centuries of contact rather than conquest alone. But this narrative doesn't begin with the Han. It reaches back further, to the shadowy figure of the Baiwe, a term used by ancient Chinese to describe dozens of tribes scattered across what is now southern China and northern Vietnam. Though politically fragmented, these groups shared certain cultural traits: wet rice farming, tattooing, stilt houses, and likely spoke a mix of Proto-Austroasiatic and Tai-Kadai languages. Modern genetic research reveals that today's Vietnamese populations, especially in the north, show clear continuity with these ancient southern groups. In fact, some components of kin DNA trace more closely to the Baiwe than to the Han, indicating that the roots of northern Vietnam's genetic profile run deeper than the imperial histories often emphasized in textbooks. What this means is that Han influence, while real, layered itself upon a much older local base, one that had been developing long before Chinese texts recorded its existence. This ancestral core likely absorbed Han input over time, integrating certain lineages while preserving distinct regional identities. Even mitochondrial and Y chromosome data support this blended picture, showing signs of male-biased admixture, where Han men may have entered local communities through political dominance or migration, while maternal lineages remained largely native. This dynamic also explains the genetic nuances between different regions of Vietnam. In the north, there is a stronger signal of East Asian ancestry, aligned with southern Chinese populations like the Zhuang and Han. But as one moves southward, that influence fades, replaced by components linked to older Austroasiatic and Austronesian layers. The Baiwe legacy, in particular, remains underappreciated. Though often dismissed in historical records as tribal and uncivilized, these communities played a pivotal role in shaping the identity of what would become Vietnam. Their agricultural knowledge, social structures, and genetic contribution formed the substratum of the Vietnamese genome, particularly in lowland and delta regions. So while Han China left its mark in architecture, governance, and philosophy, its genetic imprint in Vietnam is more subtle, not a wave, but a thread, woven carefully into a much broader tapestry. A reminder that history is rarely clean-cut, and identity is almost never singular. From a distance, Vietnam may seem like a seamless cultural continuum, united by language, traditions, and national identity. But on a genetic level, the country tells a more intricate story. Beneath the shared symbols and national flag lie subtle but measurable differences, quietly dividing the population across 3 regions: North, Central, and South. These distinctions aren't visible to the naked eye, nor do they follow strict political lines. But advanced genome-wide studies have revealed regional structuring within the Vietnamese population that challenges the assumption of uniformity. Each region holds a different balance of ancestral components, shaped by centuries of migration, trade, warfare, and ecological adaptation. In the north, where Vietnam's earliest political centers took shape, genetic profiles carry a higher proportion of East Asian ancestry, particularly from southern China. This reflects the long historical entanglement with Chinese states, as well as earlier influences from the Baiwa world. Yet even here, the genetic signal isn't purely external. It's layered atop ancient Southeast Asian roots, forming a complex blend that can't be reduced to a single origin. Moving into central Vietnam, the picture shifts. This region was once the heartland of Campa, a civilization shaped by Austronesian culture and extensive maritime contact. Although the Cham population has diminished over time, their genetic legacy lingers, not only among those who still identify as Cham, but within broader regional populations that absorb displaced lineages during and after the kingdom's fall. Here, DNA reveals a unique interplay between coastal gene flow and inland diversity, producing profiles that are distinct from both north and south. Further south, the story becomes even more layered. This part of the country saw later waves of migration, including the Nam Tien, the southward movement of northern Vietnamese settlers, and the expansion of other ethnic groups such as the Khmer, Hoa, and various highland communities. As a result, southern Vietnam exhibits greater genetic heterogeneity, shaped by both internal movements and contact with neighboring regions like Cambodia and maritime Southeast Asia. Interestingly, these regional patterns persist despite a relatively recent push for cultural and linguistic unity. The Vietnamese language is standardized across the nation, and government records recognize the kin as a single majority. But when scientists look at autosomal DNA, mitochondrial lineages, and Y chromosome patterns, they see microdifferentiation, slight but consistent genetic shifts that correspond with geography. These differences also echo historical realities. Mountainous terrain, river systems, and colonial infrastructure all influenced how people moved, settled, and intermarried. In places where geography allowed for fluid movement, genetic blending is more pronounced. Where isolation prevailed, whether due to environment or political boundaries, ancestral signals remain stronger and more localized. What makes this discovery so compelling is that it adds depth to national identity, rather than contradicting unity. These regional variations enrich it, revealing how local histories and ancestral paths coexist under a shared name. They offer a biological map of Vietnam's journey, one that complements the cultural one, yet speaks in the silent language of inheritance. Vietnam's genetic landscape doesn't end at its borders. In fact, many of its ancestral threads stretch beyond the country, woven into the broader fabric of Southeast Asia, revealing a story of movement, contact, and shared origins that predates nations and maps. When scientists compare Vietnamese genomes to those of nearby populations, fascinating patterns emerge. For one, the kin majority shares notable genetic proximity to the Dai people of southern China and the Thai across the northwestern border. This isn't surprising. All three groups trace part of their ancestry to similar Neolithic expansions and Bronze Age transitions rooted in southern East Asia. What's interesting, however, is how Vietnam diverged over time, creating a distinct genetic signature despite these common starting points. Unlike the deep Austroasiatic links seen in Cambodians, or the strong maritime influence in Malays, Vietnamese genomes reflect a balance, a convergence zone where mainland and coastal lineages intersect. While Austroasiatic ancestry forms a foundational layer, the Vietnamese profile includes additional components not prominent in other regional populations. These include inputs from Taikadai and ancient East Asian groups that don't appear as strongly in places like Myanmar or Laos. Among minority populations, the picture becomes even more complex. Highland communities in northern Vietnam often show stronger affinities with certain southern Chinese ethnic groups than with lowland Vietnamese. This is especially visible in Sino-Tibetan-speaking groups like the Lolo or Fula, whose DNA suggests long-standing ties across the border, preserved through centuries of shared geography and cultural continuity. In the central and southern parts of Vietnam, coastal interaction tells a different story. Here, there are faint but detectable traces of Indian Ocean connectivity, likely relics of Kampa's maritime trade and early Hindu-Buddhist influence. These links are subtle, more visible in mitochondrial haplogroups and linguistic borrowings than in large genomic segments, but they serve as a reminder that Vietnam wasn't just a recipient of northern migration. It also participated in the horizontal exchange of genes and ideas. What's particularly intriguing is the level of genetic divergence between populations that share linguistic or cultural similarities. For instance, Tikadai speakers in Vietnam differ significantly from their counterparts in Thailand or Laos at a genome-wide level, reflecting localized histories and unique admixture events. These divergences speak to Vietnam's role not as a homogeneous extension of its neighbors, but as a distinct node in the regional web, absorbing influences, yet forming its own identity. Modern technology, including full genome sequencing and admixture modeling, is now allowing researchers to trace these connections with unprecedented clarity. And what they find reinforces one powerful truth. Vietnam has always been both a destination and a passageway, a place where populations moved through, settled, blended, and left behind a record of their presence in the DNA of those who live there now. These shared genetic footprints across Southeast Asia reveal not just migration, but moments of contact, trade, marriage, conflict, and coexistence, moments that shaped the biology of nations long before those nations existed. And in Vietnam, those echoes are still alive, tucked within chromosomes, waiting to be uncovered. Beneath Vietnam's rich history and cultural complexity lies an even more personal layer of discovery, one that touches every cell in the human body. The country's genetic diversity isn't just a window into its ancient past. It also carries profound implications for modern health. Within the DNA of Vietnamese populations are unique patterns, rare variants, and disease-linked mutations that are redefining how medicine is understood and practiced in this part of the world. Recent advances in genomics have allowed researchers to examine not just ancestry, but the functional effects of inherited DNA. What they've found in Vietnamese genomes reveals a spectrum of biological traits, from adaptations to environment to predispositions for specific medical conditions. One example is the frequency of thalassemia carriers, particularly in ethnic minorities residing in mountainous areas. This inherited blood disorder, common in parts of Asia, shows clustered distribution patterns in Vietnam, influenced by both geography and historical isolation. But that's just the beginning. Genome sequencing has also uncovered Vietnamese-specific mutations linked to hearing loss, iron metabolism, and immune system regulation. Some of these variants are rare globally, but occur at significantly higher rates in certain Vietnamese populations, indicating localized evolutionary pressures or founder effects. For instance, a mutation affecting inner ear function was found to be more prevalent in isolated highland communities, likely a result of genetic drift over generations. Another fascinating area involves drug metabolism. Genetic testing has revealed that certain Vietnamese individuals process medications differently due to variations in genes like CYP2D6 and CYP2C19, which play a critical role in breaking down pharmaceuticals. This discovery has direct consequences for treatment plans, particularly in cardiology and psychiatry, where drug dosages may need to be adjusted based on genetic profiles. It's a shift away from one-size-fits-all medicine toward personalized healthcare tailored to individual genetic blueprints. Even broader population-wide data has shown signs of selection in genes related to energy regulation and nutrient absorption, hinting at long-term dietary adaptations shaped by traditional food systems and environmental conditions. These subtle genetic signatures help explain why certain health outcomes, risk factors, and even responses to diet vary across different regions of the country. This emerging field, known as population-specific genomics, is especially valuable in a place like Vietnam, where many global datasets have historically underrepresented Southeast Asian populations. As more Vietnamese genomes are sequenced, the medical community gains critical tools to improve diagnostics, predict risk, and design treatments that reflect the biological realities of the people they serve. And it's not just about treating disease. It's about anticipating it, understanding how inherited genetic factors can influence everything from childhood development to longevity. In some cases, early screening for known variants can prevent life-altering conditions before they begin. For communities with limited access to advanced healthcare, these insights could eventually drive public health strategies that are both cost-effective and culturally relevant. The body, it turns out, carries not only the memory of ancient migrations and empires, but also the blueprint for its own well-being. And as Vietnam steps into the genomic age, the knowledge hidden within its people's DNA is no longer just a tool for looking back. It's a way forward toward a healthier, more informed future. Long before the science of DNA could map human origins, Vietnam's ancestors preserved their history through myth. Legends passed from generation to generation, not in data points, but in stories. Among the most enduring is the tale of Lac Long Quan and O Co, a divine couple who gave birth to 100 sons. Half went to the mountains, half to the coast, a symbolic split that has echoed for centuries in the way Vietnamese people understand their roots. But what happens when modern genetics begins to confirm the emotional truth hidden within ancient folklore? The idea that Vietnam's people emerged from two distinct branches, one of the land and one of the sea, isn't far from what genome analysis now reveals. Scientific studies show that the population is a product of multiple ancestral streams, one tracing back to inland foragers and early farmers, the other tied to maritime groups that moved along the coast. This dual origin, recorded in myth, is now validated in part by molecular evidence, a fascinating overlap between cultural memory and biological fact. Genetics, however, doesn't just affirm old stories. It complicates them, adding nuance to what identity means in a country as historically layered as Vietnam. For centuries, the notion of being Vietnamese was shaped by language, region, and national allegiance. But the genome tells a more textured story, one in which every person carries echoes of migrations, cultural transformations, and silent exchanges that occurred long before borders existed. Even within the same village, two individuals might carry drastically different ancestral signatures, not because of recent foreign input, but because of how deeply regional variation has persisted over time. Highland and lowland populations, while unified today by language and education, often show unique genetic pathways that stretch back to entirely separate prehistoric communities. And this raises a profound question. What defines identity? Is it blood, belief, belonging, or some combination of all three? In Vietnam's case, identity is not built on a singular narrative, but a braided river of histories, each strand contributing to a shared sense of place, without erasing the differences that make each group distinct. These insights matter, not just for understanding the past, but for building a future where diversity is seen as foundational, not incidental. When people see their genetic roots extending beyond their immediate ancestors, into ancient migrations, forgotten kingdoms, and parallel communities, it fosters a deeper connection, both to their own story and to others. The myths, then, don't become obsolete. They gain new layers. The tale of the 100 sons isn't disproven by science. It's illuminated by it. The mountain and coastal divide mirrors real genetic stratification. The unity forged by a shared origin is no less powerful when that origin turns out to be biologically complex rather than singular. In truth, what Vietnamese DNA reveals is something universal. That identity is never one thing. It is the ongoing dialogue between memory and evidence, tradition and evolution. It is myth and migration, working together to define who we are and who we've always been. Scattered across continents, from Parisian suburbs to American cities, from Eastern Europe to the shores of Australia, millions of Vietnamese live far from the land their ancestors once called home. But no matter how far they've gone, something invisible travels with them, the legacy of their DNA, carrying the ancient genetic codes of Southeast Asia into entirely new environments, reshaped but never erased. The Vietnamese diaspora began in waves, some voluntary, others forced. From labor migrations during the colonial era to mass relocations following the end of the Vietnam War, each generation that left carried with them a unique blend of genetic ancestry shaped by thousands of years of cultural fusion within Vietnam. Yet what's remarkable is how much of that ancestral complexity has persisted within overseas communities, even decades and oceans apart. Recent studies examining Vietnamese populations abroad have revealed surprising continuity. Despite integration and intermarriage, many diasporic groups retain the same diverse genetic components found in their homeland, including ancient Austroasiatic markers, traces of Southern Chinese ancestry, and localized mitochondrial signatures specific to ethnic minorities. In some cases, these lineages are even better preserved outside Vietnam due to community clustering and cultural preservation practices. For example, in the United States, genetic research on Vietnamese American populations has identified regional ancestry patterns that reflect where families originally came from inside Vietnam. Northern origin families tend to show a slightly higher East Asian component, while those from the South often carry stronger signals of Austroasiatic or coastal ancestry. These micropatterns reveal that migration didn't erase regional differences, it carried them abroad, embedding Vietnamese history into the genetics of global communities. Even more fascinating is the way mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, continues to reflect deep-rooted maternal lines among diaspora families. In places like France and Canada, certain maternal haplogroups common in Vietnam's northern highlands or central coasts are still traceable in second- and third-generation descendants. These lineages serve as living connections, not just to a country, but to specific valleys, provinces, and ancestral homes. At the same time, new genetic blends are forming. As Vietnamese individuals intermarry with people from other backgrounds, they're creating hybrid lineages, carrying both ancient Southeast Asian markers and newer global components. These mixed profiles don't dilute heritage, they extend it, creating a broader narrative of identity that still honors its roots. This continuity across space and time reinforces a powerful truth. Ancestry doesn't disappear with distance. It adapts, survives, and sometimes becomes more visible when examined under the lens of science. For members of the diaspora, understanding these genetic links can offer a sense of belonging that bridges the emotional gap between birthplace and homeland. And for Vietnam itself, the global spread of its DNA is a reminder that its story isn't confined by borders. It lives on in kitchens and classrooms from Berlin to Sydney, in family trees branching across hemispheres, and in the shared memory encoded within each descendant's cells. For all the progress made in decoding Vietnamese ancestry, much of its genetic story remains incomplete, not due to lack of interest, but because crucial pieces are still missing. Despite breakthroughs in ancient DNA and modern genome mapping, entire populations within Vietnam remain understudied, their histories locked away in biological silence. Over half of Vietnam's officially recognized ethnic groups have yet to be fully represented in genomic research. These communities, many residing in remote mountainous regions or culturally protected zones, possess unique genetic lineages that could hold the key to undiscovered migration events, ancient population splits, or even forgotten contacts with regions far beyond Southeast Asia. But without full inclusion, our understanding remains fragmented. Even among the kin, Vietnam's majority, most genetic studies have relied on samples from a handful of locations, often urban or northern. This leaves vast stretches of the country, particularly in central and southern provinces, genetically underexplored. In these zones, where historical boundaries shifted and populations blended, lies potential for uncovering localized ancestries that differ significantly from the broader national average. Equally overlooked is the Y chromosome diversity in Vietnam's minority groups. While mitochondrial DNA has shed light on maternal ancestry, paternal lines remain largely unmapped in many populations. These paternal histories may contain evidence of male-dominated migration patterns, long-range trading networks, or ancient clan structures that played crucial roles in shaping community identities. The absence of ancient DNA from certain archaeological sites further limits our timeline. While some skeletal remains from the Neolithic and Bronze Age have been sequenced, entire eras and regions lack ancient genomic data, particularly those connected to the southern and highland cultures. Without these samples, it's difficult to trace how certain genetic traits evolved, disappeared, or survived across centuries of change. Another gap lies in understanding how genetics intersects with environmental adaptation. Vietnam's landscape ranges from sea-level deltas to high-altitude plateaus, from humid tropics to cool mountain zones. Yet the extent to which populations have genetically adapted to these diverse environments is still unclear. Variants affecting oxygen use, diet, and disease resistance could be hiding in plain sight, unrecognized due to insufficient data. And then there's the cultural barrier. Some communities are hesitant to participate in genetic studies, either due to concerns about misuse, spiritual beliefs, or historical mistrust. This makes it all the more important that research be done ethically, with transparency and collaboration, ensuring that scientific advancement respects the values of those it seeks to understand. What remains undone is not a flaw, it's an opportunity. A call to expand the lens, to go deeper, further, and more inclusively. Because the Vietnamese genome is not a closed book. It's a living manuscript still being written, one page at a time, in labs, in villages, in ancient burial grounds, and modern clinics. And perhaps the most exciting part? The most transformative discoveries, the ones that might redefine everything we thought we knew, are still waiting. In the end, DNA is more than just a sequence of letters. It's a living memory, not of one person, but of countless lives that came before. Every Vietnamese individual carries within them a timeline without borders, a record of survival, adaptation, and connection that stretches further than any family tree can capture. And that story, as complex and layered as it is, belongs to you. Your ancestry isn't confined to a single village or ethnic label. It reflects the footsteps of rice farmers who tilled the earth before dynasties rose. It echoes the journeys of traders navigating coastal waters long before maps had names. It holds whispers of mountain clans that passed their lineages down in silence, across generations who never wrote a single word, but left their story in your blood. Science can now read those stories, not to flatten identity into statistics, but to deepen our understanding of where we come from. With every genetic sequence decoded, another chapter is revealed. Not just about ancient migrations or historical events, but about how you are the living link between a past we're only beginning to rediscover and a future waiting to be shaped. And this isn't just knowledge to store away. It's a call to see ourselves and each other differently, to recognize that within the boundaries of Vietnam lies a nation of intertwined origins, and beyond those borders, in the hearts of the diaspora, those same roots continue to grow in new soil. The complexity is not something to resolve, it's something to honor. So, what part of this story belongs to you? Which thread of this vast ancestral fabric carries your name? Maybe your family comes from a northern highland village. Maybe from the red earth of the Central Highlands. Maybe from coastal towns once touched by the rhythms of ancient Compa. Wherever it is, your DNA remembers, even when the history books forget. And that's the beauty of this journey. The science is powerful, but the meaning lies in you. You're not just the result of history. You are its continuation,